Hi, everybody. This is Acyuta-bhava from Nightlight Astrology. It is Thursday, December 19th today, and I think this is the fourth in an installation of talks on the upcoming conjunction of Saturn and Pluto, which is taking place on January 12th. So today I'm going to talk about the history of this transit. Um, there's a couple of ways of talking about the history of slower moving outer planetary synodic cycles with other planets like Saturn and Pluto. So today, what I'm limiting this talk to, for the most part, a few exceptions, but for the most part, is looking at the most recent, um, the most recent conjunctions of Saturn and Pluto in the sign of Capricorn. And to do that, we have to go back in time quite a ways, back to the 1500s and then back to the 1200s before that. Uh, these are the last two times that we had a Saturn-Pluto conjunction in Capricorn. And I'm going to specifically talk about a period of a couple of years in the 1500s today and how a few world events um, are demonstrate or express the archetypal combination of Saturn and Pluto. So that's what we're going to do today. I want to remind you before I begin that I am in the home stretch now of my annual fundraising campaign. There are just 12 days left to go before the new year, and I am raising the support of as many backers as I can. Really good news is we broke last year's record yesterday. We broke, this is funny, we broke the record of 419 backers from last year. And we eclipsed 420. I got the news that we had eclipsed 420 backers while I was going to a local store to pick up a topical CBD ointment that I sometimes use on my neck because I sit at my desk a lot. So, in addition to yoga, once in a while, if my neck is particularly sore after a long day, I'll put a little of this CBD oil on my neck. If you know what I'm talking about, you'll laugh because for I said over and over again, 420 this is just our record from last year. It has nothing to do with anything involving the cannabis industry. So, and yet, while we surpassed 420 backers, literally, I was in a CBD store picking up my little canister of ointment. If you don't know about CBD, by the way, I have to say that as someone who, like, part of my yogic practice is that I don't take intoxications. Not a lot of people know that CBD is basically the cannabinoids from hemp and from marijuana without the THC. I mean, I think there's some kinds of CBD that include a very minuscule amount of THC, but when I get CBD, the CBD ointment that helps with pain, sometimes people take it to help themselves with sleep, all sorts of stuff. Um, it doesn't have any THC in it. So it's not mind altering in that sense. I'm not someone who enjoys that any maybe when I was in my 20s, right? But um, and 10 years of drinking ayahuasca, I've had some psychedelic experiences. So anyway, I just had to share that with you guys. I thought it was hilarious that I passed 420 backers, beating the record from last year, literally while I was in the CBD store getting my little canister of ointment. So how's that for cosmic humor? Anyway, we are well on the way to, we are going to set the bar as high as we can for next year. It's 432 backers before the end of the year, 12 days left to go. I think we can make 500 backers still, which would be amazing. That would be incredible. Remember, when you do, you can pick up a donation-based reading. It's a little reward gift I make for you personally in exchange for your donation, or pick up a variety of other donation gifts that I make that are exclusively for people who donate. And also, of course, 50% off all of my programs. If you want to know more about my programs in 2020, I made 3 videos yesterday that you can find if you go back into my archives on my channel, and they explain each of the 3 online programs that I teach. So today we're going to continue now with our talk on Saturn and Pluto. So Saturn and Pluto, this is Saturn and Pluto part 4. Today we're going to talk about the history of Saturn and Pluto, in Capricorn in particular. You can, for those who want a broader historical picture of Saturn-Pluto dynamics, conjunctions, oppositions, squares, the main quadratic sort of cycle that Saturn and Pluto go through from their conjunction to their opposition and back. there's a great book called Cosmos and Psyche by Richard Tarnas. Richard Tarnas's daughter, by the way, Becca, will be joining us on a panel discussion that I'm hosting on January 8th, talking about Saturn and Pluto. I'll tell you about that in a second. This Cosmos and Psyche book is fantastic, and it has an entire section on the historical developments that were happening or that have happened relative to Saturn and Pluto's alignments. So if you are someone who wants to know more about the way in which these great planetary cycles show up in history, especially since the advent of the outer planets, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto in modern astrology, this book is the best. So I will be reading something from that in a minute. But I also want to remind you all that on January 8th at 7 p.m. Eastern time, you're going to find this on the events page of my website, nightlightastrology.com. There's a free login link. You can log in at 7 p.m. Eastern. We've got a panel including Jason Hawley, Greg Crawford, Patrick Watson, myself, Becca Tarnas, Rebecca Gordon, Sam Reynolds, I don't think Jen Zart. So if you guys know those names, those are awesome astrologers. It's a big panel of astrologers. I'm moderating. And we have got about 25 or 30 questions about Saturn and Pluto that we're going to be handling as a group. Today, this is the last part of my series on Saturn and Pluto. I just wanted to talk a little bit about the last time that Saturn and Pluto were in Capricorn and give you some examples historically of how Saturn and Pluto have played out in history, but specifically through this most recent period in time. This was 1517 to about 1520 was the last time that these two came together in Capricorn. They've had their conjunctions happen every 33 to 38 years, if I remember correctly. I'm 99% on that if anyone wants to fact check me. But their conjunctions in the same signs are significantly more rare. So we have to go back a ways, but it's important because the sign plays a huge role. This is Saturn and Pluto in Saturn's feminine home sign. So if we go backward to 1517 to 1520, what do we find? Well, there's three events that I picked out just doing a little bit of research. I'm not like a historian. I leave this territory of astrology to better minds than myself, but I do know some things about history, and I'm able to obviously extract some of the great archetypal themes of Saturn and Pluto from within historical events, which I'll do now and then with all the planets. So from 1517 to 1520, there are three events that in some ways sort of exemplify that year. The first one in 1517 that we want to talk about, let's see if I can pull this up. Here we go. It is the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. Martin Luther publishes his 95 Theses. He posted them on the door of the Wittenberg Castle Church. And so this was right, we're in a period of time where this is 16th century Europe, and this is a political but also theological challenge that is laid down toward, aimed at the Roman Catholic Church. I'm not going to give you a big lesson about this, but essentially one of the core theological issues that's at the center of this Reformation challenge theologically, and it's a complicated topic, so please don't take my simplifying, if you're a student of history, please don't be offended by my simplification. But one of the theological issues that's at the heart of the Protestant Reformation is the issue with corruption on behalf of the clergy. The issue of the selling of indulgences, or the issue of the selling of basically like forgiveness coupons. And other things that were happening in the church that, some degree of stagnation and corruption, Saturn-Pluto, that was exposed, Saturn-Pluto, that kind of blows up in this fundamental deconstruction of the sort of power, institutional power of the church. The Protestant Reformation is obviously a huge event in the history of Christianity and in the history of the conversation between religious institutions and governmental institutions. One of the theological issues is, so there's corruption of clergy that's a part of it, or corruption of the institution itself that's being challenged. But another one of the things that come up is also this idea that we should have a more direct and less institutional connection to divinity. So one, the priest, you know, you've heard phrases probably like the priesthood of all believers. There is an idea essentially that each person, each individual person, has a more direct, more personal connection with divinity and does not have to go through the institution or the bureaucracy or even the power potentially of the priest. Now, this is a big idea, right? I mean, and it's one that people are still very divided over today on a theological level. There's still, of course, the role of ministers and you could say priests, but in some ways, the role of the minister and the role of clergy is changing as the connection between the lay person or the congregant or the average churchgoer, you could say, and God is changing. The churchgoer and God are coming together more closely. The minister is a sort of shepherd, and it's still an intermediary, but the attempt is to take away the potential for the institution to stand in an inappropriate manner between the individual soul and God. That's one of the theological issues that you'll get like in any religion class, you know, or theology class in college. This basic explanation. Again, I don't mean to oversimplify because it's complicated, right? But that's sort of one of the theological issues. How is this Saturn and Pluto? How do we see Saturn and Pluto at work in this situation? Well, quite simply because Saturn is going to represent the status quo. But interestingly, Saturn also represents death and decay. So the status quo, in some ways, is a picture of death and decay. When we try to maintain something the way that it is, that is a force against nature, because nature is always changing, always moving. Whether we're building a house or building an institution or building a government, in some ways, what we're trying to do in the world is very Jupiterian. We're trying to create a sense of coherence, order, justice, truth, morality, goodness, unity. From the Saturnine perspective, we are also a force working against nature. We are trying to create status quo, tradition, stability where we may feel threatened. And so institutions are Saturnine and Jupiterian. This is why institutional changes when Saturn and Jupiter are in the same signs are so sort of predictable. Greater institutional, governmental, religious, organizational changes are a big deal when Jupiter and Saturn get together. Now, when Jupiter is in Saturn's home sign, we know that Jupiter is in its fall. So if you go back and watch the 3 videos that I did on Jupiter entering Capricorn, you can see a bit more about how Jupiter and Saturn getting along right now, which is an interesting part of all of this. But Saturn's role is partially to do with creating institutions, but oftentimes there's that sense of creating an institution against the force of impermanence, against the forces of chaos, against the forces of outsiders. And so there's a way of trying to hold and define and limit, but also keep out the other. And of course, stagnation and decay come along eventually, and the status quo falls apart. This happens to everything, including, you know, galaxies and solar systems, what to speak of human institutions as well. Pluto is like the meteor that strikes the earth and kills the dinosaurs, right? It's the volcano erupting, the natural force of nature that's pent up, that comes and suddenly blows up and blows through the status quo in some way, and then newness can start coming through again. So there are fundamental challenges to the status quo when Saturn and Pluto get together. And that's one thing that we can see during a Saturn and Pluto conjunction, especially when Saturn and Pluto are in Capricorn, which is Saturn's home sign. So go back to the last time that Saturn and Pluto were conjoined. You have Martin Luther challenging the fundamental power and authority, sort of theologically, politically, and socially, of the Catholic Church. Very good demonstration of this. But that's just one way in which Saturn and Pluto can kind of play with one another. The other way that they can play with one another is you can see the intensification, Pluto, of the attempt to dominate, control, or harness things, especially people who have power can become more power hungry. People who believe in a tradition, an institution, an idea, a system of some kind, can double down and become really dark and intense and heavy about trying to control and maintain that power, and will go to extraordinary lengths to do so. The attempt to hold a tremendous amount of power and fight off anything that would threaten it. The doubling down on a darker, more conservative force, you could say. And I don't necessarily mean, I just mean the desire to conserve something that we have, or something that we're trying to hold. So that can be really heavy. For example, during 1517 to 1520, when these two planets, Saturn and Pluto, were dancing with one another in Capricorn last, we also had the beginning of the African slave trade. So let me read you something about this that's obviously sad. But in August of 1518, King Charles I authorized Spain to ship enslaved people directly from Africa to the Americas. The edict marked a new phase in the transatlantic slave trade, in which the numbers of enslaved people brought directly to the Americas without going through a European port first rose dramatically. So this was, there you have it, where the desire to control, to enslave. Pluto and Saturn together are a bit like the devil card in tarot, where it can be about recognizing that which we have been chained to, some unhealthy form of power, some unhealthy structure, and the insight is there to break us from the chains that bind us. Hence you have something like the Protestant Reformation, in a sense, which is sort of expressive of that, regardless of whether you are a Protestant or a Catholic. It doesn't matter so much. I'm just saying, sort of archetypally, there's this sense of like, let me break free from this oppression. While you also see the doubling down on let me control, let me try to harness, enslave, bind, or getting bound to something, becoming enslaved, putting the choker around our own necks, like you see in the devil card, where and the interesting thing about the devil card is that they could take those off at any time. It's like, they're easy to remove, right? There's, here we see during the same period of time a big change in the African slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade, but specifically now we have a dramatic change happening in that narrative, and of course that's a very dark stain on human history, and it's obviously it's also related to this idea of trying to hold, control, wield, harness power, and to enslave people in order to have power, right? That's a Saturn, restriction, limit, Pluto, power. So the two come together, and sometimes it's not so much about breaking free from the chains, taking off the devil's bondage, but it's about putting it on or doubling down on it. Well, that's not a great thing. Finally, there's this other really interesting event that I thought was worth mentioning that I've never even heard of before I started doing a little bit of research for this talk. And this was actually called the Dancing Plague of 1518. It was a case of dancing mania that occurred in Strasbourg, which is now modern-day France. You can look this up on Wikipedia. It's really interesting. Around 400 people took to dancing for days without rest, and over the period of about a month, some collapsed and even died of heart attack, stroke, exhaustion, etc. The outbreak began when a woman began to dance fervently in a street in Strasbourg. This lasted somewhere between 4 and 6 days. Within a week, 34 others had joined. Within a month, there were around 400 dancers, predominantly female. Some of these people died from heart attacks, strokes, or exhaustion. One report indicates that for a period, the plague killed around 15 people per day. A dancing plague, right? Like, isn't that crazy? Historical documents, including physician notes, cathedral sermons, local and regional chronicles, and even notes issued by the Strasbourg City Council, are clear that the victims danced. It is not known why these people danced, some even to their deaths. As the dancing plague worsened, concerned nobles sought the advice of local physicians who ruled out astrological or supernatural causes. Instead, they just didn't know about Pluto yet, maybe. Instead, announcing that the plague was a natural disease caused by hot blood. However, instead of prescribing bleeding, authorities encouraged more dancing, in part by opening 2 guild halls and a grain market and even constructing a wooden stage. The authorities did this because they believed that the dancers would recover only if they danced continuously night and day. To increase the effectiveness of the cure, authorities even paid for musicians to keep the afflicted moving. The strategy was a disaster after those policies were applied to the illness went a dramatic growth. It got bigger. Performing dances in more public spaces facilitated the spread of the psychic contagion. Modern theories include food poisoning caused by the toxic and psychoactive chemical products of ergot fungi, which grows commonly on grains in the wheat family, such as rye, that was used for baking bread. Ergotamine is the main psychoactive product of ergot fungi. It is structurally related to the drug lysergic acid, LSD, and is the substance from which LSD-25 was originally synthesized. Isn't that interesting? And the same fungus has also been implicated in other major historical anomalies, including the Salem witch trials. Okay, so, I like a fun story as much as the next. I just thought that this was so bizarre and so interesting. I had never heard about it. Maybe you guys have heard about it before. But here's how it exemplifies, how it is expressive of Saturn and Pluto. Here you have convention, Saturn, being completely broken open by the floodgates of the Dionysian force, power, and upsurge of Plutonian chthonic energy, underworld energy, potentially caused by a fungus, maybe? So people just went completely bonkers dancing. And that's the thing that can also happen, is surprising structures of consciousness can be just blown open by these sort of Dionysian Plutonian forces. Pluto, one of the greatest associations with Pluto mythically is not just Hades, but also Dionysus. So, and one of the things, if you know a little bit about Dionysus, is that there's a kind of explosion of ecstasy, drunkenness, madness, revelry being torn apart. That comes along with the Dionysian ecstasy. And so I think it's really interesting that one of the other peculiar things about this transit is that it can point to different forms of, I'm sure what long ago was called mass hysteria, but really could be an indication of forces, psychic containers not being able to hold any longer. Physical containers sometimes too. That's why we literally see volcanoes blowing up. And there was a few volcanoes in here historically as well. If you go back to the last period, 1282 to 1285, there's some interesting stuff there as well. I'm not going to go into it, but there was a volcano during that period. Things that are supposed to contain and hold can blow up. And, if that means dancing until, dancing, it doesn't seem bad, but, a plague of dancing and everyone's dancing until they die, like that's pretty crazy, So, but it just goes to show that like really crazy things do happen. Things that break out of the norm, that break the norms wide open psychically, spiritually, emotionally. We don't talk so much about that Saturn and Pluto because we're so used to focusing only on Saturnian structures that are like, church, state, society, law, things like that. But actually the containers of normalcy, of sanity, etc., sometimes they get broken open too in interesting ways. And Pluto can be about the release of some kind of pent-up psychic emotion. And it's funny how that works in the collective. Like, you guys probably agree that the collective is an entity, right? Like there's not just one collective, there are many collectives. It's like a very elaborate ecosystem of human beings, obviously. So cultures, races, people, countries, etc. And sometimes what you see is some kind of pent-up tension just bursting through. And it's not just in terms of the practical fallout or revolutions or leaders or governmental challenges or wars. It's not always as formal as that. Sometimes it's nice and cuckoo. You know what I mean? Like it's nice and crazy spiritual. So that can happen as well. I thought that you guys would find those instances interesting. If you go back to 1282 to 1285, there's a few interesting episodes. The one thing I want to mention is that there was an important like edict. Where was it? Circumspect Agatus, I think that's how you say it. It was an English statute issued by King Edward that defined the jurisdictions of church and state, forcing church courts to confine themselves to ecclesiastical cases. That's another really very eerily similar to the Protestant Reformation in terms of the theme of a challenge between church and state, or a political challenge to the church, or a way of defining and limiting the church's power, things like that. So, of course, I don't think it was long after Martin Luther's nailing of the theses to the door of the castle church, that he was excommunicated by the Pope, I believe. But at any rate, you also have the theme of outsiders challenging the status quo, who are they're sometimes scapegoated. They're said, oh, and then they become the symbol for someone who's trying to challenge peace or security. And also, again, just general challenges to the political, religious, institutional, governmental, corporate status quo can happen with massive restructurings that occur. Now, one thing that's really interesting, that you guys may find interesting, is I'm going to read you one passage from Richard Tarnas to close. This is not going back now to the 1517 to 1520 era, but it is sort of speaking to this theme of conservative empowerment. Returning now to the Saturn-Pluto cycle on its own terms, we can examine more closely the diachronic patterning of historically significant events coinciding with the successive conjunctions, then with the intervening squares and oppositions. The events of the 1981 to 84 conjunction period, this is the last time in recent history that we had a conjunction, I believe it was in Libra. The wave of conservative and reactionary empowerment throughout the world and the climactic intensification of the Cold War antagonism between the two superpowers, United States and Russia, can be recognized as closely related to the events of the immediately preceding Saturn-Pluto conjunction of 1946 to 48 at the beginning of the Cold War. During the earlier alignment, the emergence of the Iron Curtain and Soviet domination of Eastern Europe was met in the United States by the establishment of the many enduring anti-communist and Cold War political and military structures that characterized the American response to that state of sustained global crisis and tension. These included the founding of the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, the National Security Council, and the Department of Defense, the formulation of the containment policy in George Kennan's influential paper in Foreign Affairs, and the assertion of the Truman Doctrine, the intensification of the anti-communist hearings by the House Un-American Activities Committee that led to the McCarthy era, the establishment of the Hollywood blacklist, and widespread anti-communist witch hunts, among many other comparable phenomenon reflective of this archetypal complex. Remarkably, George Orwell wrote 1984, his dark vision of totalitarian oppression and control, during the Saturn-Pluto conjunction of 1946 to 48, and placed it in a year, 1984, that happened to coincide with the very next Saturn-Pluto conjunction one full cycle later. Orwell's writing of the book was driven by his growing fear and conviction that not only had a Cold War, his coinage, begun against totalitarianism, but that in this critical period of the later 1940s during the conjunction, the Western democracies were losing it. These two periods of 46 to 48 and 81 to 84, and now currently, that coincided with the two successive Saturn-Pluto conjunctions bear a close historical and archetypal connection to the period of intervening opposition of the same two planets. And so he goes on to then describe what happens when the cycles after conjunction go to their oppositions, which is really interesting as well, beyond the scope of today's talk. But I highly recommend that book, Cosmos and Psyche, if you want a really good read about the Saturn-Pluto dynamic from the historical perspective. It's interesting that the same sort of global narratives are present right now with the United States and Russia, with the fear of extreme, the kind of subtle power struggle between extreme groups on both the left and the right. You could say that as well as, you know, we kind of potential to witch hunt for people, you know, on the far right. People are witch hunting those on the left. On the far left, the people want to witch hunt those on the right. So it's an extremely polarized moment of power struggle over the future of the institutions that govern and hold power in law and government and so forth. And of course, there's likely, I would say, to be the implications of this will play out not just in January, but throughout the rest of 2020 as well, as we're going into an election year here in the USA. You can see similar things happening with a Brexit in the recent elections in Europe, and as all over the world, these Saturn-Pluto tensions are really apparent. So what do we do with all of that? That's where I want to end our talk today. It's important that this is, you know, these are just my opinions, of course. It's important that we be very aware of the fact that we are a part of history. We're political animals. I think it was Aristotle who said that. We're political animals. We can't help but be, a part of the city, a part of the state, a part of the government. To some extent, we are involved. We are implicated. Just like Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita tells Arjuna that he can't just ditch the battlefield, it's impossible for most of us to not have feelings about these things. And I don't know personally that I don't believe it's very healthy to try to pretend as though we don't. At the same time, there's a saturation point where astrology can really help us not go beyond that saturation point of stress, fatigue, psychic and emotional burnout from the tensions of the moment that we're living in. Because when we look at history and we see that the same basic archetypal forces are working and weaving and reweaving themselves into the narratives of history, the narratives of society and great empires or countries and so forth, institutions of religion, we know that these movements, these periods of crisis and contraction, as Richard Tarnas calls them, we know that in earlier video I said we know that this is a part of how nature, the cosmos, the manifest material energy works. We know that these things are cyclical, and so if we study them with some degree of detachment, if we can take time to reflect upon them astrologically, then even though we're implicated, we are political animals who are going to play a role. What is it? Walt Whitman, the powerful play goes on, and you may contribute a verse. I think that first time I ever heard that was in the film Dead Poet Society before I'd even read Walt Whitman. But so while we're here to contribute a verse, we also have to remember that ultimately we are beings without beginning or end, that the motion that is causing the circle of archetypal narratives to spin round and round in such beautiful, intricate, different ways, evolving and dancing and changing over millennia, that the motion that's pushing that around for ancient astrologers is the same motion that propels our soul without beginning and without end. And it means so much more to figure out how to relate to our historical moment, to our temporary transient body and temporary transient role that we're playing right now with heart and courage, but also being able to see the transcendental, not forgetting the motion of the soul that's propelling the mighty stagecraft. So I feel like reflecting on history is a really interesting way of remembering that in one way, while everything feels so real and intense and so relevant right now, so, you know, there's so much at stake, that in another sense, there's nothing new under the sun, and there is nothing at stake. If we can be creatures of paradox. I believe we are beings of great paradox. The more I get to know myself, the more that I feel that a lot of who I am is a bit of a paradox. Maybe you feel the same. Well, if we have any tolerance, any patience, humility enough to accept this paradox of life and the world we live in, that it's something is at stake and nothing is at stake, and that both can be true. When we learn how to hold that tension, we can really inhabit the stories, the karmic stories that we're here to live with greater integrity, and we can see the divine with us and start to see this as the play of the divine. And from that standpoint, it's easier to shift our perspective into love, adoration, affection, and union, yoga, with that divine presence. So I hope that you find this encouraging. It's not just an exercise in recycling old storylines, just for the heck of it. It also does have a larger spiritual purpose for us as students of astrology. So that's what I've got for you guys today. This will be the last part, and then, grand finale on January 8th. Come check out the big panel discussion. Lots of good astrologers coming out to give a talk together. I will be posting that on my YouTube channel as well afterward, but you can join us live, ask questions, hang out. You go to the events page of my website, nightlightastrology.com. You'll find the login info. I don't know if it's up today. It might be up tomorrow, if not today. It's Thursday the 19th, so check back on the 20th tomorrow if it's not up today. So that's what I've got. And remember my Kickstarter, I got 12 days left. Pitch in if you can. I really appreciate your support. Thank you so much already. And remember, you can get the courses for 50% off as well. Okay, take care, everyone. Bye.